I will begin at the end because that is how this story insists on being told, with smoke from the grill twisting into the Texas sky, with the entire cul-de-sac standing around my driveway like a jury that accidentally RSVP'd to a block party, with a folding table covered in evidence that looks ridiculous until it does not, a stack of printed phone logs and plastic sleeves, a binder of city noise ordinances highlighted like a high school project, a thumb drive taped to an index card, and a stainless steel mixing bowl full of water that I keep for my dog Copper, but that now reflects the face of my neighbor, the man who called my boss and tried to get me fired because I allegedly played a guitar too loudly on a Tuesday evening. His name is Randall Pierce. If you have never met a man who can weaponize a whisper, allow me to introduce him. In the reflection, he looks upside down, which feels correct. I am Ethan Walker, and if this were a baseball game, I would tell you the inning, but this is not a game. It is the climax of what the Homeowners Association would call a dispute, and what I now call a chapter in the long American saga of neighbor revenge. The grill hisses, my friends nod, and my boss, Mr. Davenport, stands at the edge of the driveway with a face that says, "I was dragged into this, and now I cannot look away." Randall holds his arms out like a preacher about to bless the brisket and says, "I am a danger to the peace of the neighborhood and to myself." Someone laughs, someone else coughs. I tell Randall that tonight is not about the brisket, and not about my dog, and not even about the Homeowners Association in their printed polo shirts which they wear like armor. Tonight is about a phone number on a call log that repeats at 6:01 in the morning and 9:42 at night and noon on the dot, as if synchronized to a metronome, and that number belongs to Randall, and the destination belongs to my boss, a man who does not live here, who does not hear my garage door or my acoustic guitar or the late-night hum of my shop vac after I sand a plank for the coffee table I promised my sister. I lift the plastic sleeve and let it flap in the evening air. "You called him," I say, repeatedly. "You told him I was noisy. You told him I was insubordinate. You told him I was volatile. You told him I was unprofessional," which is a word that looks like a simple adjective until it lands on a paycheck and turns into a threat. The cul-de-sac murmurs. The teenagers hover near the cooler, pretending they do not care while they care deeply, because Adults in Conflict is the original reality television. Randall says, "I am lying." I say, "I printed it all." I point to the emails. I point to the recorded voicemail that Mr. Davenport forwarded to me after I finally told him the whole story, after I swallowed the pride that tastes like rust and said, "Sir, I believe my neighbor is calling you to poison my job." The voicemail is muggy and full of certainty. Randall telling my boss that I host garage raves and invite motorcycles and bang tools after midnight, which is strange because I go to bed at 10, and my most scandalous midnight activity is eating cereal out of the box while watching fishing videos, which I suspect is the opposite of a rave. I tell you this because it is true, and also because I want you to understand that I'm very ordinary until you force me to be strange, and that, right there, is the heart of neighbor revenge in America. A man wants to turn your life into noise, so you make silence out of his power. Mr. Davenport clears his throat and asks if we can roll back a bit, and someone cracks open a soda, and the sunlight leans toward the roofs, and I say yes. Let us invert the whole story and go back to the beginning, which is not actually the beginning, it is last month, the day a stranger looked at me across his desk and told me I had a problem with noise control. The day began like any other weekday in Plano. I drove my Silverado down Spring Creek Parkway, stopped at the gas station where the coffee is always too hot, and the cashier always remembers my face because Copper sticks his head out at the back window and acts like he is running for office. I arrived at the warehouse, clocked in, and headed to the office for our regular production meeting. Mr. Davenport, who dresses like a clean whiteboard, said he wanted to see me after. I assumed the forklift certification schedule had shifted again. Instead, he closed his door and fixed me with a face that management must practice in a mirror. "Ethan, we have received several calls from someone claiming to be your neighbor." The word several stuck to the back of my throat like peanut butter. I asked when. He said over the past 2 weeks. He said the man insisted I was disruptive at all hours. He said the man provided precise times, which clearly impressed him, because precision has a way of impersonating truth. I sat there, a 38-year-old man who pays his mortgage on time and builds furniture on weekends, being told that my life had been recast as a noise complaint by a stranger who shares a fence with me, The meeting ended with a friendly but formal warning, and the phrase company image floated like a cartoon cloud I wanted to pop with a pin. I walked out of the office and the warehouse hum swallowed me. Coworkers smiled in that way where you can tell they know something about you that you did not know about yourself 30 minutes ago. I texted my sister, Claire, and told her that some neighbor named Randall had called my boss. Claire sent the thumbs up emoji because that is what she does when she wants to keep me from jumping to conclusions. At lunch under the pecan tree behind the loading dock, I waited for anger to arrive like a storm. But something stranger came first. A cold clarity, as if someone had rubbed Windex on the day, and now everything had edges. When I got home, I stood in the driveway and looked at my block with new eyes. The water meters blinked in the grass like little machine hearts. The porch lights waited for dusk to tell them who to be. Children rode bikes. The air smelled like someone's attempt at ribs. Nothing about it looked like a war zone, and yet a friend of mine inside a suit had just said my neighborhood was a problem for my employment. I put my hand on the fence and Copper lay down at my boots, and I listened. Somewhere a sprinkler spun with a soft tick-tick. Somewhere a dog barked like he was telling a joke. Somewhere a garage door grumbled like an old man standing up. None of it rose above the volume of life itself. I almost convinced myself I was imagining things until I noticed the curtain in the Pierce house lift, just enough for an eye to claim ownership of the evening. The eye belonged to the man I had waved at when I moved in 3 years earlier, and who had not waved back. The man who watered plastic flowers at 3 in the morning, which I know because Copper peed at 3 in the morning sometimes. And we live in a world where everyone can see everything if they are interested enough. What followed next was not my finest hour, but it was honest. I knocked on Randall's door with my knuckles like a polite person, and when he did not answer, I knocked like a person who had a reason. He opened the door in a pale blue shirt and a belt that announced itself before he did, and he said, in a voice that sounded like a tape measure snapping back into its case, that I had brought the noise to his porch. I asked him straight if he had called my boss. He smiled the way teeth smile when they want to be believed. He said there is a chain of command in any civilized neighborhood. He said he had tried to go through the homeowners association, but they were too slow. He said he had called the city, and the city had suggested mediation. He said he decided the fastest way to correct me was to notify my employer so that my wallet would correct my behavior. I said that was not neighborly. He said the word neighbor did not appear in the city code. He said he had decibel readings, which is a phrase that would make anyone feel guilty if you did not know that a decibel reading can be anything when you point it at a wall and decide the wall is a drum. I walked home with Copper, and the feeling that I had been measured and found noisy, and the quiet between houses felt like a witness who did not want to testify. That was how the end began, with one man using a phone as a weapon and one man holding a guitar pick like a matchstick in a dark room. I did what any American raised on football and fairness does when someone aims at the place you feed yourself. I made a plan. I printed the city ordinances and circled the part about daytime allowances. I bought a humble decibel meter and learned that my vacuum at 9 in the morning did not even flirt with illegal. I pulled footage from my doorbell camera showing peaceful Tuesday nights, one of them featuring Randall, who prefers to be called Mr. Pierce, running his lawnmower at 9:58 in the evening because he enjoys slicing a lawn in the dark like it is a secret pie. I took notes like a man in a detective show where the villain is yard maintenance. I called the homeowners association, spelled out because I refused to give them the dignity of initials now, and the president said she would schedule a conversation and then forgot because her calendar is a jar of marbles rolling away. I told my boss I was gathering facts. He said, bring them when you have them. When I hung up, I looked at Copper, and Copper looked back, and we had the kind of conversation you can only have with a dog, where he tells you with his eyes that revenge is fun, but peace tastes better. I said I would try to believe him, but first, I had to do what men like me do when provoked. I had to build something. The thing I built was not a table and not a bookshelf, and not the pergola that my sister keeps hinting about every time she shows me her backyard and says, would it not be amazing if a pergola just appeared here? What I built was a case, a proper case, the kind of case that satisfies two audiences at once, a man in a tie who asks for facts with a smile, and a neighborhood that craves spectacle as if it were barbecue sauce. The first piece of the case was the timeline. I made it with a carpenter's pencil on butcher paper, stretched across my kitchen table, and when Copper tried to help, I bribed him with peanut butter. The timeline began with the meeting in Mr. Davenport's office and ran backward like a worst-case parade. Every night I documented when I closed the garage, when I used the miter saw with the shop vac attached, when I plucked my old Martin in the driveway with the amp unplugged because I am not an animal. I pinned every phone call to my boss that he could share, which he did after I explained that the calls were impacting my reputation and my paycheck. He is a practical man. When he heard the way Randall's voice swelled with righteous civic duty, he winced and said he did not know how he had missed the peculiar joy in it the first time. He apologized for the formal warning and said he would remove it if I could prove a pattern of exaggeration. I told him to come to my place on Saturday night, just to watch, just to witness. The second piece of the case was the culture of the block, which is a phrase that sounds too fancy for a row of roofs and mailboxes, until you realize that every American block trains itself to a rhythm. The Simmons family throws a birthday party once a month because they have 4 children and a grandmother who insists that cake is a right. The Squians run a woodworking club in the evenings once a week, and no one complains because their dovetail joints are better than television. The Alvarezes host a dawn walking group that laughs like people who have outrun something. On paper, our block is a noise machine. In truth, it is a neighborhood, which means there is a treaty made out of casseroles and patience. I printed signs for an impromptu Saturday cookout at my place and slid them under doormats. I did not say it out loud, but I was recruiting jurors who already knew the ambient soundtrack of our little city. The only person I did not invite was Randall, because I wanted him to feel like the kind of person who had to ask why he had not been invited. And then I wanted him to show up anyway, because he is exactly that kind of person. The third piece was oddly theatrical. I purchased a cheap party fog machine from a discount store, because sometimes you have to illustrate a point in the American language of big gestures. I also borrowed a projector from Claire's church and set it up to cast doorbell camera footage against the garage door after sunset like the neighborhood's own outdoor cinema. Call it satire, call it therapy. I call it taking back the frame. I understand that none of this would hold up in a court of law, but I was not in court. I was in the court of the cul-de-sac, where comedy and evidence share a folding chair. As I tested the projector on Friday night, Copper watched the footage of himself sniffing the mailbox with deep concern about the double he saw on the garage door. When Randall walked past on his evening constitutional, he glanced over, saw himself mowing in the dark on a Tuesday, and did that thing where a man smiles at a dog because he cannot smile at the truth. On Saturday morning, I went to the farmer's market and bought a brisket that could have starred in its own movie. I rubbed it with coffee and brown sugar and pepper until my hands smelled like a diner at dawn. I set the smoker to whisper. While the meat transformed, I finished the binder. The binder was a story told in receipts and timestamps and decibel screenshots. I found a city code enforcement officer named Lennox who answered my email faster than the homeowners association ever has and confirmed in writing that my daytime work and mid-evening cleanup fell well within legal limits. I added Lennox's note to the binder with the kind of care you reserve for a library book that is already late. Then I wrote an introduction that explained how a neighbor's private vendetta had spilled into my public workplace, and how a single person's appetite for control had become the soundtrack of my days. I did not use the word harassment because I did not want to turn the binder into a weapon I was not ready to use. I used the words pattern and misrepresentation and corrosion because that is what it felt like. A slow eating away at the edges of what I knew myself to be, a man who minds his business and keeps his promises and tries to be useful. When evening fell and the neighbors arrived, the cul-de-sac transformed into a small town fair. Children tossed a football. Someone's uncle argued about the Dallas Cowboys with the reverence of a man recounting family history. The Alvarezes brought street corn that made people say things like, "I could cry right now." The Nguyens brought a sample box of puzzles they were designing for teachers, which is a very Plano act. I shook hands until my palms felt famous. Then I told the story, not with drama, but with a carpenter's voice, steady and exact. I said that a neighbor had called my boss. I said that my job had been threatened. I said that I wanted to address it in the open not to humiliate anyone, but to reassert the treaty of casseroles and patience. I said the phrase neighbor revenge once, quietly, because I wanted it in the air like a spice, something you could taste without seeing. When Mr. Davenport arrived in his weekend shirt and looked around at the entire block gathered like a chorus, his eyebrows climbed in a way that told me he had expected a sob story and had walked into a civic event. The projector hummed. I played a short reel. Normal evenings, Copper yawning, me sanding a plank. The Nguyens walking past with a hello, the Simmons kids racing scooters, Randall rolling his mower into the night. People laughed kindly at themselves on screen. Then I played a recording of Randall's voicemail, and the laughter stopped on its own. He sounded like a man giving a weather report about a hurricane that only he could see. He did not sound angry, he sounded proud. He sounded like an auditor of other people's air. When the clip ended, a hush settled. I did not let it curdle into cruelty. I lifted the binder, and I thanked everyone for listening. I said that I would like to invite Randall to speak, and if he chose not to, that was fine, but I wanted him to hear me say this. I will not be defined by your fear of noise. I will not be coached by your need to control. I will not let you outsource your discomfort to my paycheck. At that exact moment, Randall stepped forward from the edge of the crowd with a smile that pretended none of this was odd. He held up his hand like he was about to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. He began with a sentence that launched this story into the absurd, which is to say, into the truth of how suburban battles actually feel when they go too far. He said he was part of a group he called the Silent Guardians, a community initiative to restore the original acoustic purity of American neighborhoods, and that he had been trained, informally, in decibel assessment by a friend who used to work at a factory. The phrase original acoustic purity floated like incense, ridiculous and somehow menacing. A teenage boy snorted. Mr. Davenport studied the man as if he were a new machine you needed to handle with gloves. I felt my anger rearrange itself into something more powerful. It was not about winning anymore. It was about translating a private obsession into a public mirror so that everyone could see what it did to us. He spoke for several minutes in a rolling cadence about sound discipline and moral order, and by the time he drifted toward the subject of enforcement mechanisms, the sun had melted behind the roofs, the projector made a soft whir, and the fog machine I had hidden near the porch released a faint, comic plume because my cousin Tyler could not resist the button. The little cloud curled around Randall's ankles like a stage effect, and the block laughed despite themselves. He scowled at the fog like it had committed a felony. I thanked him for his honesty. I said that I would be presenting my binder and my timeline to the Homeowners Association on Monday, and that I would be copying the city code officer named Lennox. I said that my boss had heard him, and that my boss had now heard all of us. I said that if he had a grievance, he should use the channels we all use, which is to say, talk to me like a man or file a complaint with the boring people in nice shirts. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then he did what men like him sometimes do when the crowd refuses to crown them. He went home and turned on every light in his house. The block returned to the table. The brisket surrendered. Copper leaned against my leg like a verdict. Neighbor revenge had begun to change form in my hands, from a strike to a story, from an eye for an eye to a mirror for a mirror. I could lie here and tell you that the next day was a triumphal march into righteousness, that the Homeowners Association apologized in chorus and the city sprayed the street with applause. But the truth is, we woke up to Sunday morning, and Sunday morning is stubbornly ordinary. I made pancakes. Copper licked a skillet in a way that would make my grandmother talk about hygiene. Church bells floated from somewhere. The only visible consequence of the previous night was that Randall's house now resembled a lighthouse during a power outage, lights blazing in every window, like a man trying to convince the moon he could do the job better. I stood on my porch, gripping a mug, and watched him march around his front yard with a clipboard. He wore a whistle, which he had not worn before. I cannot explain the whistle. Perhaps when a man has declared himself a silent guardian, he needs a prop that sounds like the opposite of his mission. Perhaps he wanted to signal to the birds. I do not know. All I know is that my block had moved into the phase of a suburban conflict where reality softens around the edges and a farce swims up to the surface and blinks at you. That afternoon, the world cracked open an inch wider. The Homeowners Association sent a message inviting us to a special meeting on Wednesday at the community center next to the tennis courts. The message was written in that warm, bureaucratic tone that says, "We are not mad, we are disappointed, and also please bring your dues." I printed it and slid it into the binder. I reached out to Officer Lennox, and he said he would attend in an unofficial capacity to answer questions about the noise code. He used the phrase educational, which made me feel like we were planning a field trip. Meanwhile, Mr. Davenport emailed me to say that the formal warning had been suspended pending the outcome of this block-level investigation, which is a phrase that sounds like a new streaming series. He wrote that he appreciated the care I had taken in gathering evidence. He also wrote that the voicemail I had shared kept him awake the previous night, because of the certainty in the caller's voice. He did not say fear, but I read fear in the spaces between the words. Between Sunday and Wednesday, events took a turn from seriousness toward satire, and then from satire toward conspiracy, and then from conspiracy into something that I will call suburban myth because it still makes my skin cool when I think about it. On Monday, a brown package arrived at my door addressed to me but ordered by no one I knew. Inside, I found a decibel meter deluxe kit with calibration pieces and a lanyard. No note, no receipt. I imagined Randall sending me a gift to keep me honest, or perhaps a setup to frame me as the neighborhood auditor. I placed the kit in the binder, not out of spite, but because the binder had become a museum exhibit titled The Sound We Make and the Story It Tells. On Tuesday, a different package appeared on Randall's porch. The label read Silent Guardian Starter Pack. Someone had a sense of humor. When Randall opened it, a cascade of glitter shot into the air like a party that had been buried alive and dug itself out. I swear to you, I did not order it. I suspected the teenagers, who had the faces of people keeping a mutually beneficial secret. Randall stood in his glitter storm with the calm of a man who believes he is bulletproof. He shook his clipboard, and glitter rained down like a blessing. That night, I walked Copper, and under the sodium glow of the streetlights, I noticed symbols drawn in chalk near the drains. The symbols looked like a mix of hopscotch and a diagram from a conspiracy documentary about the way suburban streets map onto ancient star patterns. A child explained that the chalk was for a game they had invented called Noise Police, where one kid pretended to be Randall and the rest of the children hid and tried to stay under a certain imaginary decibel threshold. I did not know whether to laugh or kneel. The kids had taken our adult mess and turned it into a myth with rules and a referee. I decided to be a good myth participant. I walked on the chalk lines like tightropes and hummed at a whisper. Copper chose to break every rule by wagging with audible enthusiasm. In that moment, my anger drained by half. The second half of my anger was rumbling away somewhere toward Wednesday, toward the meeting where the neighborhood would decide whether we were a community or a collection of mutually suspicious islands. Wednesday arrived in a warm gust. The community center smelled like dust and laminate floors. A long table stretched across the front, where the Homeowners Association board, yet wearing their tournament smiles. The room filled with neighbors. Mr. Davenport took a seat in the back, like a man who wanted to be present but not center stage. Officer Lennox leaned against a wall, with the comfort of a man who has seen much worse than this. Randall entered last. He wore a tie with tiny microphones on it. He placed a small black device on the table that looked like it could measure the heartbeat of the room. He called it his personal decibel standardization unit, which I am almost certain was a weather radio. When the meeting began, the president thanked everyone, recited a paragraph about community values, and then did the most dangerous thing you can do in a room like that. She opened the floor. The first 10 minutes were polite gripes dressed in Sunday best, lawn lengths, recycling bins, dogs off leash. Then the soundtrack shifted. The Simmons father talked about the birthday parties and how the laughter echoes, and how that echo is the sound of people believing they are safe. The Nguyen spoke about their woodworking evenings and the way the block lets them make sawdust without shame. Mrs. Alvarez described the Dawn Walking Group and how it has kept 2 of their friends from drowning in grief. Each testimony was a hymn to the ordinary noise of a life well lived. I presented my binder like a civics project. I spoke without flourish. I showed the timeline. I played the voicemail. I handed the picture of Randall mowing at night to the president, who studied it for longer than the frame required. Then Randall rose. He did not shout. He did not need to. He wielded perfect enunciation like a baton. He described an America that had lost its sound discipline. He spoke of a golden time when men maintained their yards without the soundtrack of portable speakers and children understood the sanctity of evening quiet. He compared my guitar to a megaphone and my shop vac to a jet engine, which drew a laugh that he mistook for applause. Then the lights blinked. The projector hiccuped. The room fell into a hush that was not fear, but that anticipation you feel right before a summer storm punches the heat out of the day. The door at the back opened, and an elderly man I had never seen before shuffled in with a cane that glowed faintly, as if it had lightning trapped inside. He wore a hat from a local baseball team that folded years like an accordion. He walked to the front, placed his cane on the table, and said, in a voice as dry as the prairie, that he had lived on that block for 30 years, and that peace never came from a meter. It came from a handshake and a plate of something hot. He looked at Randall and said he remembered when the previous owner of Randall's house used to run a garage band that practiced Creedence Clearwater Revival every Thursday, and nobody died. He looked at me and said he remembered when the previous version of me used to be a teenager who launched bottle rockets, and someone taught him to clean up the sticks without making a rule about it. He told us a story about a time the power was out for 3 days, and the whole block gathered in the dark and discovered that quiet does not exist. It is always filled with breath and footsteps and the click of cards and the way people clear their throats before they say something worth hearing. Then he did something that passed fully from satire into myth. He tapped his cane once, and the weather radio on the table made a soft chirp, and every phone in the room glowed with a weather alert about a coming wind. People looked down as one, and in that pocket of distracted light, I felt the story changing shape. This was not a meeting anymore. It was a ritual of recommitment to the idea that a block is a choir, not a solo. The president cleared her throat and announced a motion, a formal censure of harassment by phone to any neighbor's employer, a written understanding of quiet hours that respected reality, and a requirement that grievances go through the channels designed for them. The motion passed with only one hand raised against, and that hand belonged to a man who did not seem to understand that he had just lost the power he loved. Neighbor revenge had become neighbor repair, and I was not sure whether to cheer or sit down and weep. You may think that is the end, but this story wanted one last twist of the wrench, one last flourish of the fog machine, one last look at the way people cling to a story that used to serve them and will not anymore. The day after the meeting, I found a note tucked under my wiper blade. The note was written in block letters that tried too hard to be official. It said that I was now on probation with the Silent Guardians, which would have been hilarious if probation did not rhyme with a word I heard in Mr. Davenport's office. It included 3 commandments of sound: no guitars after 5, no power tools on weekdays, no laughter that carries. I took the note inside and placed it in the binder, which had grown heavy with the weight of our neighborhood's learning curve. I brewed coffee and stared at the wall where a fishing rod leans and imagined a world in which I complied and slowly disappeared into a man-shaped apology. Then Copper dropped his ball at my feet, and I remembered the old man's cane and the way it thumped life into the table. I called Randall. I told him he was done calling my boss. I told him I would file a police report if a single more call went that direction. I told him that if he wanted quiet, he could knock on my door and ask for it, and we would figure out a schedule like men do when they live 15 feet apart. He tried to reply with a lecture about sound ethics, and I said, "No, we are done with sermons." He hung up. I let the dial tone erase him for a moment. Life resumed in that messy way it always does after a civic melodrama. The Simmons family threw a birthday, and the cake was chocolate, and the candles refused to light because the wind decided to have an opinion. The Nguyens taught me to cut dovetails with a handsaw, and it felt like finally fitting into the same century as my tools. The Alvarezes added 2 new walkers who had moved into the rental where the Fernandez family used to live, a young couple who worked nights at the hospital and moved with the tired grace of people who keep strangers alive. On Friday, I invited Mr. Davenport to stop by for a beer, and he did, and he laughed at Copper and told me that he had decided to put the warning into the shredder and to document the incident as an external harassment attempt with no credibility. He told me to keep the binder because he suspected the binder would be useful if Randall relapsed. Then he did something I did not expect. He asked me to build a coffee table for his wife's reading room. He said he trusted my hands. I had trouble speaking for a second because trust, once stolen, is hard to spend again. Saturday night brought the finale that makes this story tilt into fantasy and then plant its feet in the dirt again. I rolled my grill to the driveway for another small gathering. The projector was packed away. The fog machine sat in the garage like a retired clown. The air smelled like pecan smoke and the promises of ordinary life. Then the wind arrived. It came like a stranger who knew the route. Branches danced. Paper plates tried to migrate. The teenagers chased a football that behaved like a kite. In the middle of this, Randall stepped out of his house carrying a suitcase. He crossed the street and stood at the edge of my driveway and looked like a man rehearsing a speech he had forgotten the lines for. I waited. The block waited without making it obvious. The wind tugged at his tie until the microphones looked like little black birds trying to escape. He said he was leaving for a week to visit his sister. He said he had decided to resign from the Silent Guardians, which I found amusing since I suspected the membership roster was him, and a memory of him. He said he had spoken to the homeowners association president and agreed to abide by the new procedures. He paused. He stared into the mixing bowl of water I keep for copper, as if he could see himself in the surface and not hate the reflection. He said something so human that I felt my ribcage loosen. He said he did not like how noise made him feel, that it made him feel out of control, that he had grown up in a house where chaos sounded like cabinets slamming, and he thought if he could control the decibels, he could control his heart. He said he was sorry for calling my boss. He did not cry. He did not perform. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a pool, unsure whether he could survive the water. I told him there was a Saturday morning woodworking workshop at the Nguyen's garage. I told him I would be there with a coffee and a willingness to be wrong about him. He nodded. He rolled his suitcase back across the street. He turned off the lights in his house for the first time in days. The wind pushed and then released. After he left, the block settled into a silence that was not quiet. The silence held the rustle of leaves, the clink of ice, Copper's chain tapping the bowl, the faraway whine of a siren reminding us that our lives are small inside a city that contains every possible story. I took the binder into the garage and set it on a shelf. I did not lock it because I wanted to believe I would not need it. I played my guitar for 10 minutes with the garage door open just enough to see the night. I kept it soft because spite is loud and peace whispers. When I finished, I unplugged nothing because I had never plugged anything in. I sat on the tailgate of my truck and thought about neighbor revenge one more time, how I had planned to sink a hook into Randall and tow him across the neighborhood until everyone saw his scales, and how the old man with the glowing cane had tapped the table and turned my attention to something older than victory. The long, slow work of choosing not to let someone else turn you into a version of yourself you will not recognize in photographs. In the days that followed, the block organized a sound map for fun. The children walked with clipboards, writing down the good noises of the neighborhood, the thump of a basketball, the whir of a blender making milkshakes, the 3 barks of a dog who wants to be included, the single laugh that floats over a hedge and lands like a bird. We pinned the map to the bulletin board at the community center. We called it the choir. The homeowners association president teared up, which I did not see coming, and said that perhaps we had been treating sound like a code violation when we should have been treating it like a language. Officer Lennox sent an email that said, "Thank you for making my job boring again." Mr. Davenport sent a picture of the reading room and the place where the table would go. Randall stayed away for a week, then 2. When he returned, he did not wear the whistle. He came to the woodworking morning and stood next to me while I showed him how to hold a chisel without fear. He asked if he could try a dovetail. I said the block will decide if it is too loud. He smiled like a man who had found the joke at last. So, here is the ending, the real ending, the one I promised at the beginning, when the smoke curled and the call logs glinted and the bowl reflected a man upside down. Neighbor revenge began as a strike, an urge to balance the scale with spectacle, and somewhere between the fog machine and the cane and the motion to censure, it turned into a choice. I did not forgive what did not belong to me to forgive. I did not become friends with a man whose hobby had been my humiliation, but I did decide to let my best self be louder than his worst impulse. When people ask me about the day my neighbor tried to get me fired by calling my boss about me being noisy, I tell them the truth with a smile that is not a weapon. That is not a neighbor, I say. Then I add the part that matters. A neighbor is what happens when a block agrees to be a choir, and the choir learns the difficult song that says peace is not the absence of sound. Peace is the discipline to listen, the courage to speak at the right volume, and the wisdom to know that the loudest thing you can do is show up with proof, lay it on the table, and then choose not to strike when everyone tells you that you would be justified if you did. That is the only version of neighbor revenge that anyone on my street remembers now, and it is the only one I want.